In the shadow of a twilight sky, a lone figure stands at the river's edge, whispering tales of courage and silent devotion. Welcome to Vale Marks, where every story lifts a veil on truths that stir the soul. Today's video reveals a heart-stopping rescue by an aging canine, teaching us that love and bravery can emerge when we least expect them. Reflect on the words of Maya Angelou. Courage isn't having the strength to go on. It is going on when you don't have strength. Stay with us until the very end to witness a conclusion that will touch your heart and leave you inspired. Share your thoughts below and join our journey toward 1,000 subscribers as we continue crafting stories that resonate deeply. The late summer sun hung low over the Potomac, casting long golden reflections across a rippling canvas of water that seemed to shift between hues of amber and lavender. The riverbank was lined with weeping willows, whose slender branches cascaded toward the surface, their leaves just beginning to catch hints of gold. A few stubborn maple leaves had already turned, drifting in gentle spirals across the grass, as though they, too, sensed something momentous on the horizon. The entire scene exuded a hushed anticipation, as if the landscape itself were holding its breath, waiting for an unseen event to unfold. On the small wooden porch of a weathered clapboard house perched just above the river's edge, 78-year-old Margaret Hayes rocked slowly in her old-fashioned rocker. Her silver hair, tucked neatly under a faded sun hat, caught the last rays of daylight, and her face bore the soft lines of time and memory. In her hands, she cradled a bulky VHS camcorder, one of those relics from the 1980s that still hummed and clicked whenever the REC light blinked to life. It had been a gift from her grandson Charlie, who knew how much she treasured keepsakes of a bygone era. Now, as Margaret's gaze shifted from the camcorder to the stretch of water beyond, her eyes grew distant with recollection. Decades ago, Margaret's husband, Henry, had been a fixture of local lore, a strong, kind man who prided himself on fearlessness and compassion. One autumn evening, Henry had heard a cry for help echoing from the same river. A small child had slipped from the rocks and tumbled into the churning current. Without hesitation, he had stripped off his coat and plunged into the chill, raging water. He had rescued the child, delivering him to safety on the muddy shoreline, but he himself had become entangled in a hidden undercurrent. By the time Margaret and onlookers had reached him, Henry was gone, claimed by the river he had so often admired. Today, Margaret's porch chair sat angled toward the very spot where Henry had made his ultimate sacrifice, and every breeze seemed to carry a tremor of that long-ago moment, equal parts pride and sorrow. Directly beneath Margaret's perch, curled like a faded quilt, lay Jack, a German shepherd with silver fur that glinted faintly in the soft light. At 9 years old, he was well past his days as a canine officer in the state police. His once muscular frame had thinned, and scars on his shoulders and flanks, trophies of countless searches and rescues, now showed in stark relief beneath his graying coat. Even in rest, Jack's posture spoke of resilience. His head lifted just enough to survey the river, his ears perked ever so slightly. For a fleeting moment, as his eyes fluttered shut, it was clear he drifted back to scenes of time long past, flashes of dusty training grounds, the blur of city streets at night, the detonation of a flashbang on some raid that he had helped execute. His dreams were haunted by distant echoes, the sharp crack of gunfire, the scent of gunpowder mingled with fear, the gratitude of a family whose lost member he had returned. But then Jack's brow furrowed, and his coat bristled, as if he had heard something that tugged him from those memories. With a low, deliberate movement, Jack tilted his head. The willows by the bank rustled more audibly, and the tall reeds stirred against one another. A subtle, almost conspiratorial rustle that seemed to speak directly to him. Margaret, sensing Jack's sudden alertness, reached carefully for the camcorder that Charlie had secured. She pressed her fingers to the small button, and the REC light on the camcorder clicked on, illuminating her with a gentle red glow. The world beyond her porch seemed to tether itself to that single, blinking light, holding every last mote of dusk in suspended anticipation. Charlie Hayes, dark-haired and lanky for his 13 years, crouched behind a cluster of flower pots at the edge of the porch. He held the camcorder just so, fingers hovering over the zoom lever. Earlier that day, he had practiced capturing images of Jack's old K9 training medals hung on the living room wall, and now he waited with a combination of boyish excitement and deep respect. He had often listened to his grandpa's stories about Jack's exploits, the time Jack tracked an elderly dementia patient who had wandered off at midnight, or the mission to locate a lost hiker amid a snowstorm in the Shenandoah. Every tale had seemed larger than life, but in this moment, Charlie sensed that something equally momentous was about to unfold, one that might connect Jack's storied past with an unexpected future. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, the wooden slats creaking softly. She could see Jack's eyes narrow as he focused intently on a point just beyond the break in the willows. The setting sun painted a final streak of gold across the river's surface, and as it did, a faint glimmer appeared, a shape bobbing strangely among the waves. The camcorder's lens caught it first, and the bright red REC light pulsed steadily, a metronome for this unfolding drama. Charlie's breath caught, and Margaret's heart fluttered, each pulse echoing the hushed anticipation in the air. As the shape drifted closer, the realities of that dim, late summer evening seemed to crystallize, the past and present converging at the water's edge, the legacy of Henry's bravery, the wisdom of a grandmother who knew what it meant to suffer loss, and the silent promise of Jack's unwaning devotion. The river itself seemed to pause, as if respecting the gravity of the moment, the hush of the willows intensifying. In that suspended hush, Margaret felt a familiar tug, a whisper of fate gently guiding her toward what must come next. Even as the golden light faded to a softer purple, Margaret's resolve solidified. Something was happening that required more than nostalgia. It required action, memory, and courage. She tightened her grip on the camcorder, ready to witness whatever lay ahead. Charlie, despite his youth, felt a surge of responsibility. He straightened, camera steady now, determined to capture each instant. And Jack, the old canine soldier, rose to his paws with a fluid grace that belied his age. His ears stood erect, nostrils flaring as they caught the scent of something unusual drifting on the evening breeze. Margaret inhaled deeply, tasting the mingling scents of impending autumn, earth, drying reeds, and the faint tang of the river itself. She whispered to Jack, "Go on, old friend, show us what we must see." With that simple plea, she felt Henry's presence at her side, encouraging her to trust in Jack's instincts, just as she had trusted her husband so many years ago. The willow branches shivered, and the camcorder's lens lingered on the dark form moving toward them. In that moment, past and future coalesced at the water's edge, and every memory Margaret had ever guarded seemed to align with the single, urgent truth. A new chapter was beginning, and they were all poised to witness it. The river, that ancient artery of history, had one more story to tell, one that linked the echo of Henry's sacrifice with the living spirit of Jack, and with the tender heart of a grandmother who refused to let fate slip away. As the final sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, the REC light pulsed defiantly against the growing twilight, and the hush of the Potomac was broken only by the promise of what was about to unfold on its quietly churning waves. The surface of the Potomac glistened beneath the late summer sun, each ripple catching a shimmer of gold and lavender as a gentle breeze stirred the water. A few cooler eddies hinted at approaching autumn, carrying a faint crispness that played on the surface. In the dusky light, Charlie Hayes aimed his bulky Super 8 VHS camcorder toward what at first appeared to be a stray bundle of reeds drifting downstream. He zoomed in just as the fading sun illuminated a slender wicker frame floating alone, its edges frayed and wobbly. The basket was a warm, sun-bleached brown, curved gently like a cradle, and it teetered precariously against the current. Charlie's heart pounded. In the dimming glow, he could just make out a tiny shape curled inside the cradle. He adjusted his lens, so the word REC glowed bright red on the camcorder's viewfinder. Every click of the tape gear echoed softly in the hushed air. He leaned forward, eyes wide, feeling the sudden shift from carefree afternoon to urgent reality. The cradle rolled over slightly, revealing the pale face of a little girl wrapped in a white woolen blanket. Her lips were ashen, and she barely stirred, only a faint huh, escaping her. Beside her, a baby boy lay curled, wearing a faded blue knit cap that slipped down over his eyes. He trembled in the chill, the wind tugging at the edges of the blanket. The river's current slapped at the basket, sending a spray of water droplets that splashed over the worn wicker, each drop catching a final glow of sunlight. At that moment, Margaret Hayes, standing nearby on the bank, froze, as if rooted to the spot. She was drenched up to her thighs, her faded denim skirt soaked and clinging to her legs. The white apron she always wore, tied loosely over her dress, was plastered to her waist, trailing wet fabric that flicked at her ankles. In her arms, she clutched a thick knit shawl, ready to pull it around whoever or whatever needed warmth. As she watched the cradle drift closer, her eyes brimmed with alarm and sorrow. It was a sight no grandmother should ever witness. Two tiny, helpless beings cast adrift upon the river. Yet even as fear welled in her chest, Margaret did not hesitate. "Jack, go!" she called, voice steady, despite the tremor in her throat. Just beyond her, Jack, the aging German shepherd, rose from a crouch beneath a weeping willow. His muzzle was flecked with grey, and his once powerful shoulders still bore the scars of years spent as a canine rescue dog. Now, in his 9th year, he was slower, his breathing heavier, but his spirit remained unbroken. When Margaret spoke his name, Jack's ears pricked, and he offered a low, resolute growl. In that moment, he recalled his time in service, the nights spent tracking missing children through dense woods, the adrenaline of chasing down fugitives in the city, and the final mission that earned him a canine medal for bravery. These memories rippled through him like a flash of lightning, igniting a flame of determination. Without a second's hesitation, Jack leaped into the water. Each stroke was laborious, as if his muscles briefly remembered the strength of youth, but balked at the weight of age. The current tugged at his coat, sending chills through his frame that he met with a soft whimper. Yet he pushed on, his legs driving forward, clearing each wave with dogged resolve. Every scar on his flanks stretched with the effort, and his breathing rasped like a dry whisper. In his mind echoed a single, unyielding thought. I have crossed battlefields and saved lives. This day I will not let these children perish. On the bank, Margaret waded in until the cold water lapped at her waist. She held the shawl aloft, as though offering a beacon of warmth for whichever of the babies Jack could reach first. "Jack, keep going. They need you," she called, her voice a blend of command and plea. Every second felt like a lifetime, the river's roar amplified in her ears. Charlie, from his vantage point a few yards back, kept the camera trained on the unfolding rescue. He could see Jack's broad back cutting through the water, the pup's sleek form a testament to years of disciplined training. A rush of emotion tightened Charlie's throat until he had to swallow hard. He tightened his grip on the VHS camcorder, the red RX light unwavering as the tape whirred. "Jack? Jack's bleeding," Charlie muttered, catching a flash of crimson near Jack's flank where a jagged scar had reopened. "I can't run away. I have to record everything." His voice, though soft, carried a weight beyond his years. He knew that if no one ever believed this, these images might be the only proof of the old dog's heroism. Closer to the cradle, Jack slowed, his breaths labored. Finally, he managed to reach out with his mouth and hook the basket's edge between his powerful jaws. The cradle tilted, spilling a few drops of swaying water across the pale blankets within. Grace stirred, her voice cracking into a small, frightened cry. Ethan's limbs jerked involuntarily as he took in the shift, his body reacting first to the cold and then to the sudden sense of rescue. Jack held tight, his muzzle wet with river water and salt, and began to backstroke toward shore. Each step was a battle. The current tugged at him, and his older muscles ached, but his resolve never wavered. Margaret saw Jack falter for a moment, water chest high, before the loyal dog lifted his head again and forced himself forward. The cradle scraped along the riverbank just as Margaret shut her eyes. She knelt in the shallows, arms extended. Come on, she whispered, her voice thick with relief and fear. With one final, determined thrust, Jack beached the cradle on the far edge of the shallows. He tipped it gently with his muzzle, nudging Grace free. The little girl's tiny arms flailed in the water, but Margaret's swift hands closed around her and lifted her to safety. Then Margaret reached for Ethan, while Jack, trembling, collapsed onto the riverbank, his sides heaving. Charlie stood to his feet, stepping closer to get a better shot. "That's it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The cradle lay empty now, the blankets sodden, but the children were in Margaret's arms, bundled in the old shawl. Grace's wide, frightened eyes met Charlie's camera lens for an instant, a fleeting moment of recognition, as though she understood that someone was there to tell her story. Ethan's blue cap fell off as he opened his eyes and blinked away tears. He looked toward Jack, who struggled to rise, and for a moment, the world stood still. Margaret turned toward the water, wrapping her shawl tighter around the children. "We'll get you dry," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. Her gaze flicked to Jack's weary form, and she hurried to guide him out of the shallows. He rose slowly, shaking his coat, droplets flying in every direction like tears. He limped, but his eyes shone with a fierce pride, as if to say, "They are safe." At the exact moment Jack cleared the waterline, a distant motorcycle rumbled behind him. Its roar cut through the fading quiet, like a portent, tethering the triumphant rescue to a darker mystery still waiting downstream. The growl of the engine echoed against the opposite bank, and all at once, the warm glow of victory was tinged with a chill of foreboding. Margaret cast a worried glance over her shoulder. "What's that?" she muttered. Charlie lowered the camera for an instant, furrowing his brow. The cradle rescue was over, but the questions had only just begun. As Jack sank slowly to his belly, panting, the river seemed to sigh behind him, carrying a promise that the next chapter, one of truth and reckoning, was already in motion. Jack hauled the wicker cradle out of the water and dragged it up onto the riverbank, every motion labored by fatigue and cold. Grace clung desperately to the curved handle as if her tiny life depended on it, because it did, and her lips trembled into a weak, huh, at the edge of the basket. Ethan, her twin brother, nestled himself against the cradle's side, his small body trembling so fiercely that Margaret could almost feel his teeth chattering from where she stood just behind him. As Jack pushed the cradle farther onto the sand, His breath came in ragged gasps, and his sides heaved. Ice-cold droplets slid down his muzzle, mingling with the streaks of salt water from his swim against the current. The old canine's front paws trembled, and he crouched, head low. In a final show of devotion, he nudged Grace free, and Margaret caught her up, wrapping the little girl in the dry wool shawl that she always kept in her basket. Then she reached for Ethan, who gave a faint, fearful cry when her arms closed around him. Jack's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed, every muscle shaking as if he would not breathe again. Margaret knelt and scooped Jack into her arms, cradling him as she comforted the two rescued infants. "My Jack," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "I cannot lose you now, not when these angels need you most." She braced herself for a worst-case scenario, half expecting Jack to slip away into a final rest. Instead, he lifted his head, a pitiful, hopeful gesture, and blinked once before his body went limp, and he rested his chin on her shoulder. At that moment, a thunderclap of rubber on gravel cut through the quiet as Sheriff Daniel Stone's jeep screeched to a halt on the grassy verge. Stone, a tall, stern man whose shoulders were permanently squared against the burdens of his badge, stepped out with purpose. His eyes hardened when he saw the two babies swathed in Margaret's arms, and Jack slumped between them. "Mrs. Hayes," he said evenly, hiding any flicker of sympathy, "those children need official documentation. Birth certificates, guardianship papers, anything. You can't keep them here without proper records." Margaret's chest tightened as she held Grace and Ethan closer. "They are living souls," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You can't push them into a cold foster system. They need warmth. They need family." Her mind tumbled back to the day Henry, her beloved husband, waded into a storm-swollen Chesapeake to save a drowning child before he himself was claimed by the river. The memory of Henry's final sacrifice tightened a vice around her heart. She could not, would not, stand by and watch two more children be swallowed by bureaucracy. Sheriff Stone hesitated, his gaze flicking from the trembling babies to Jack's hopeful eyes. He recalled the night before, lying awake, dreaming of Jack, straining through dark waters, eyes fierce with determination. He had woken, drenched in sweat, as if the dog's unspoken plea had been whispered into his ear. Now, seeing Jack's life laid bare on the damp sand, Stone's throat constricted. "That dog, he tries to tell me things I can't ignore," he admitted under his breath, though no one heard. As Stone drove off to arrange transport for the infants, a ripple of murmurs rose from the few onlookers who had gathered. Herminia, the sharp-tongued neighbor, stumbled from beneath a maple tree, arms folded, disdain flickering in her eyes. "She's far too old to raise a newborn," Herminia muttered, her voice thick with judgment. "Where will she find the strength?" Meanwhile, a cluster of octogenarians and septuagenarians sipped coffee on folding chairs by the riverside cafe. "My father warned me never to abandon a child to the currents," said Mrs. Miller, voice steady though her hands quivered slightly. Beside her, Mr. Johnson, leaning on a cane, tapped a knuckle against his heart. Jack may have saved two innocent souls, but we all know law is law. "We need to find who dumped those babies first." In the autumn's chill, truths can freeze or be illuminated. As Margaret watched Stone's taillights vanish down the river road, she felt the weight of every skeptical glance and whispered doubt. Yet her conviction only deepened. These children were now her responsibility. Behind her, Charlie's VHS camera whirred faintly, capturing the scene that would soon be the first clue in unraveling the darker mystery. At that instant, a slender figure emerged from the shadows of the boathouse. A familiar presence to Margaret, if only she had known. And though the world's rules pressed ever closer, a new resolve settled in her heart. She would not rest until her small family was safe. Esther Parker arrived at the quiet riverside with the determined gait of a lifelong investigator. Having spent decades as a reporter for the Washington Chronicle, She was accustomed to the rigors of chasing a story, no matter how dark or dangerous. Her hair, pulled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck, held a few stray grey strands that framed her face, lines of time etched around her eyes. In one hand, she carried a battered leather-bound notebook, whose pages were brittle and yellowed from age, the ink of her pilot pen barely visible against the fading lines. Slung over her shoulder was a single-lens film camera, the kind photographers once used to capture moments on celluloid before the digital age. Esther understood the power of tangible evidence. The tiny whir of the film winding in the camera was a promise that today's discoveries would be preserved forever. Margaret Hayes met her at the foot of a long, narrow dock that arched over a tangle of decaying pilings and reeds. In Margaret's hand was a rusty padlock and a small, weathered key. She lifted the lock and passed it to Esther, her voice hushed. This belonged to Emily Carson, the young mother who disappeared. She left clues here, lost records, maybe her journal, or photographs. Margaret paused, her knuckles white around the key. If anyone can find them, it's you, Esther. Esther nodded, accepting the key with a firm grip. The air was cool and carried a faint tang of algae and moss. Autumn was whispering its arrival through a soft breeze that rattled the skeletal frame of the boathouse. The structure beyond the dock stood as a skeleton of its former self. Wooden planks, rotted and buckled, supporting a roof of rusted corrugated metal so punctured that sunlight pierced through in scattered beams. The wind howled through broken windows and jagged boards, carrying the creaking of timbers that shifted under the slightest pressure. It was easy to imagine the boathouse in its better days, alive with laughter, the slap of oars, and families launching small boats to enjoy midday picnics on the river. Now, a hollow echo reigned, where once joyful voices rang out. Inside, Esther flicked on a small LED flashlight, the beam slicing through a fog of dust motes. She moved deliberately, allowing her eyes to adjust to the shifting shadows. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight as she stepped carefully, mindful of nails protruding from the planks. Her film camera, held at the ready, clicked quietly as she began to document the scene. A fishing net draped over a corner post, a pair of old binoculars coated in grime, and a tangle of rope coiled like a snake on the floor. She traced each detail with her gaze, knowing that any of these objects might be a silent witness to the tragedies hidden here. In the darkest recess of the room, where her flashlight's beam barely reached, a lump of fabric caught her attention. It was the edge of a blanket, folded over itself as if to conceal something beneath. Esther knelt, her knees creaking, and gently lifted the corner. Beneath lay an old sepia-toned photograph, edges yellowed and curled. It showed Emily Carson standing in a dimly lit church interior, her hand clasped around two infant children, Grace and Ethan, while a tall figure in the background, half turned and shrouded in shadow, stared down at them. The man wore a dark overcoat and his face was obscured, but the unmistakable posture and stance left no doubt. Esther recognized that silhouette as Victor Hayes, a local man recently rumored to be involved in illicit activities. Her breath caught. She pressed her knuckles against her chest, stifling the sudden thumping of her heart. Emily had been just a teenager, barely 17, exhausted from waiting for her babies to arrive. Now, in the photograph, she stood alone in that sacred candlelight, her expression one of hope tinged with fear. Esther's mind flooded with images of Emily's brief, tender life, plucked from a long line of faithful churchgoers, baptized in hope and goodness. The photograph held a tragedy in suspension. Emily's determination to bring her children into the world and the malevolent presence of Victor just behind her. A glint at Esther's feet caught her eye. On the warped boards lay a silver locket, its surface dulled by rust, but still engraved with the initials E.C., 1707, Our Love Forever. She picked it up, the cool metal pressing between her fingers like a message from a past that refused to stay buried. Her vision blurred as she turned the locket over and traced the date with a trembling fingertip. Emily's final testament, Esther realized. An heirloom meant to seal a promise of love. Now it served as the key to unmasking the darkness that had taken Emily and endangered her children. Above her, the wind rasped through the slits in the boathouse walls as if to remind her that no secret could remain hidden forever. Behind Esther, Charlie, eyes bright with adrenaline, whispered into his VHS camcorder, "I think I've captured enough to convince anyone. There's no disputing this." Through his lens, the dusty film flickered, immortalizing the trembling hand of Emily, placing that locket on her daughter's chest, while Victor's dark profile lingered just behind. Those grainy frames would become the heart of Esther's report, a visceral confrontation with the unacknowledged evil that lurked beneath the river's gentle surface. Footsteps approached, and Esther snapped the camera shut, slipping it into her satchel. Sheriff Daniel Stone stepped gingerly inside, every bit as cautious as she had been. He had come to confront the boathouse's truth, a truth that would challenge his own understanding of law and morality. The sheriff's eyes fell upon the photograph cradled in Esther's hand. A flicker of doubt passed across his face as he murmured, "Perhaps I've underestimated the signs. A crime isn't always on paper." Turning, he left Esther and Charlie to the evidence they had uncovered. In his wake, the boathouse's rancid breath seemed to sigh, an exhalation of secrets finally forced into the light. As Esther pocketed the locket, she felt a quiet vow settle in her chest. Emily Carson would no longer be invisible. She would regain her voice, and her children their legacy. Father Michael Reynolds, awaiting her return at St. Anne's Church, would soon learn of the photograph's power to rewrite their future. Baton in hand, Esther began her trek back to the riverbank, the weight of the past now balanced by the promise of justice. And in the autumn wind that followed her steps, it felt as though the river itself murmured its approval, carrying in its currents the hope of redemption for two lost souls. The Alton County Courthouse was packed to capacity. Reporters clustered near the front benches, villagers crowded the aisles, and neighbors, old and young alike, filled every available seat. The overhead lights cast a yellow glow on the polished wooden signage that read Alton County Court, as if the very air was charged with anticipation. In the center of it all, at a long oak-paneled table, sat Prosecutor Rachel Kim. At 45, her sharp voice and unwavering gaze had made her the county's most respected legal mind. She leaned forward, smooth papers in hand, and addressed the judge with measured calm. "Your Honor," she began, her tone crisp, "we will submit evidence that paints a complete picture of the crimes committed by Victor Hayes." The large courtroom screens flickered to life, showing the first piece of evidence, Charlie Hayes's VHS footage in slow motion. There, in grainy but unmistakable detail, Jack, the aging German shepherd, battled the current to deliver two infants to shore. The husky growl, extracted from the tape's audio, echoed throughout the courtroom, prompting gasps from the audience. Rachel clicked a remote, and the frame froze on Jack's determined eyes, drenched with river water, straining toward two helpless children. Next, Rachel displayed Esther Parker's film photograph, taken in that dilapidated boathouse. The image showed Emily Carson clutching her newborn twins by candlelight. Behind her, Victor Hayes's figure loomed, half hidden in shadow. The congregation had gone silent, absorbing the stark contrast between Emily's hopeful face and Victor's menacing silhouette. Even the judge leaned forward, eyebrows knitting in concern. "Your Honor, you will note the date on Dr. Foster's records, Rachel continued, raising a worn ledger. Emily Carson was admitted here at 19, 7 months pregnant with twins. She vanished before she could deliver, leaving no trace. The only clue is this handwritten note: "I will not relinquish my children." The ledger's pages were open to a page that confirmed the doctor's account. Emily's chart ended abruptly on July 17th. Finally, Rachel held aloft the silver locket, its engraving legible under the spotlights. EC 1707, Our Love Forever. "Your Honor," she said, "this locket belonged to Emily and was found at the boathouse in the exact spot where she was forced to leave her babies." Gasps rose again, and Victor Hayes, dressed in a black suit and leather gloves, remained impassive. His cheeks were flushed, as if struggling to contain anger or fear. Victor cleared his throat. The weight of every stare in the courtroom pressed on him. "I have been falsely accused of trafficking," he said, voice low. "But let's not pretend a noble dog can substitute for actual evidence." He glanced toward Jack, who lay on a makeshift mattress in an open kennel near the back. The old canine rested his head on trembling paws, his eyes half closed, as if too weary to object even to this injustice. Rachel reached her final moment. "We have threads that tie these crimes to Mr. Hayes beyond doubt. He ran childcare operations that matched the pattern of missing infants. 2 children, Grace Hayes and Ethan Hayes, ended up in Mrs. Hayes's care only after Jack's heroism made it impossible to ignore. Mr. Hayes must answer for his actions." Then, unexpectedly, Sheriff Daniel Stone rose from the rear of the courtroom and walked to the witness stand. At 55, Stone had once believed in rigid enforcement of the law above all else. Now, his voice shook with unaccustomed vulnerability as he faced the judge. "Your Honor, I believed I was doing right by removing those children to protective custody, but after witnessing Jack's rescue and investigating the boathouse, I can no longer remain silent. There are souls worth listening to that aren't captured in paperwork. I stand with justice and the truth." Stone's admission sent ripples through the courtroom. He had been the one who initially argued for holding Grace and Ethan until their status was verified. To hear him endorse their rescue and condemn Hayes was a seismic shift. His eyes flickered over to Jack, who lifted his head at the sound of applause from the back rows. The sheriff had effectively abandoned his previous stance, acknowledging that law would serve no purpose if it ignored acts of compassion and bravery. A hush fell as Judge Harrison, a 70-year-old man whose face bore the gentle firmness of someone accustomed to balancing mercy with discipline, prepared to deliver a verdict. Even the gavel seemed to pause mid-air. "This court," he said slowly, "recognizes the overwhelming evidence. Mr. Victor Hayes is hereby sentenced to 25 years for human trafficking and child endangerment. Grace Hayes and Ethan Hayes are legally placed under the guardianship of Mrs. Margaret Hayes." Margaret crumpled into tears, her slender shoulders shaking as she reached for her grandchildren. Grace and Ethan pressed close to her, their small forms seeking comfort in her arms. Nearby, Jack slowly rose, every movement betraying his aching joints and wounded spirit. He limped toward their enclosure, and for a moment the courtroom felt as though it acknowledged the dying embers of his courage. The last rays of daylight through the limestone windows illuminated Jack as he lowered his head, his eyes reflecting a profound relief. In his final act, he seemed to remind everyone that even an aging dog could stand against injustice when no one else would. As the judge banged his gavel, the courtroom exhaled a collective breath of resolution. Jack's labored breathing echoed a silent roar against the tedium of everyday rules. Sometimes, a single act of devotion could topple a mountain of lies. And in that golden, fading light, Jack's silhouette was etched into the hearts of all present, an unspoken testament to the power of truth. A small plaza beside the Potomac had been transformed into a place of reverence. Red, white, and blue buntings fluttered overhead, their fabric catching the last rays of the sun like living ribbons. Rows of wooden benches, each topped with simple cushions, stretched before a low dais. A single podium stood ready, draped in a modest cloth to shield it from any stray raindrops or wind gusts. At the plaza's center, shining with an almost sacred light, was the freshly unveiled statue of Jack. Cast in antique bronze and standing approximately 1.2 meters high, the sculpture captured Jack in a moment of quiet triumph. His aged body sprawled as though spent from exertion, muzzle gripping the handle of a wicker cradle, and eyes lifted toward the heavens, bathed in the glow of sunset. On the stone plinth beneath him, an inscription read, "Jack, a canine dog who did not remain silent when humanity called." Among the assembled crowd were Margaret Hayes, stooped yet dignified at 78. Her smiling grandchildren Grace and Ethan, both now 5 years old, clutching her skirts. Charlie Hayes, now 15, camera slung around his neck as he watched every detail. Esther Parker, the seasoned reporter whose heart broke for Emily Carson. Sheriff Daniel Stone, the stoic lawman whose conscience had been shaken. Father Michael Reynolds, offering silent prayers. And Rachel Kim, the prosecutor whose sharp intellect had ensured that justice found its footing. Around them, villagers, many of them older than 50, filled in every nook. Their wrinkled faces reflected an eager desire to honor a hero whose bark was louder than any injustice. Margaret approached the statue, her shawl trailing behind her, and knelt before Jack's likeness. In her hand, she held a single golden maple bloom, its petals crisp with autumn's promise. With trembling fingers, she placed the flower at Jack's bronze paws. Her voice, though quavering, carried to every corner of the plaza. "My dear Jack," she whispered, "I once thought I would never be saved again after losing my Henry to these same waters. Yet here you are, reminding me that salvation can come when we least expect it. Thank you for bringing us these two angels, Grace and Ethan. You taught me that love, no matter how late, will never fade." As Margaret pressed her forehead against the cool metal, she pictured Henry standing on the opposite bank, nodding and smiling through tears. Her own eyes glistened with fresh sorrow and enduring gratitude, for in Jack's brave act, she had found a reason to love again. When her words trailed off, Sheriff Stone stepped forward, grasping the microphone with hands that still seemed to shake. His voice, heavy with admission, filled the hushed space. "I was once certain that the law was enough to guide me," he said, eyes tracing Jack's upward gaze. "But Jack taught me something deeper. Justice is not confined to statutes and regulations. It is a force that lives in the brave heart of a dog who refused to stay silent. Tonight, I stand in his shadow, humbled." His gaze flickered to Jack's bronze eyes, as if seeing them ignite with purpose once more. In that instant, Stone recalled the dream that had awakened him weeks earlier, where Jack had swum against dark waters, eyes blazing brighter than lightning, a silent plea echoing in his mind. Next came the children's tribute. Grace, cheeks flushed with excitement, dashed to the front of the dais, her small fist clenched around a bright red ribbon. "Jack," she called, voice sweet yet determined, "I give you this ribbon. I love you the most in the whole wide world." With that, she pinned the ribbon to the statue's sturdy collar, her wide eyes shimmering with childlike faith. Ethan, more reserved, stepped up afterward. He held a piece of newsprint from Charlie's camera, a charcoal sketch showing Jack pushing the wicker cradle against the swirling currents. Ethan placed the sketch at Jack's paws, his own tears slipping silently down his cheeks. In his innocent mind, the statue appeared as more than bronze. It was a guardian who had poured hope into his tiny heart, ensuring he would never forget. Above them, the Potomac's surface caught the last hues of sunset, shifting from gold to rose to lavender in a silent affirmation. Jack had indeed broken the quiet, and now it was time for the world to keep listening. The river's gentle murmur seemed to carry his story downstream, a reminder that every soul has a voice, and some, like Jack's, speak without words. A few months after Jack's heroism and the ceremony that crowned him with a bronze likeness, a small coffee shop named Potomac Memories opened its doors beside the riverbank. Margaret and Charlie had turned an old boathouse into a cozy sanctuary where sunlight filtered through half-broken windows and warmed mismatched wooden tables. Along one wall, shelves held row upon row of VHS tapes, Charlie's footage of Jack plunging into the water, reels that crackled with the faint sound of rushing currents and that gravelly canine growl. Interspersed were Esther Parker's film photographs, images of Emily clutching her twins, Victor's shadowy figure receding into darkness. Large prints of Rachel Kim's articles covered another wall, each headline announcing that justice at last had triumphed. Visitors, whether silver-haired seniors or teenagers on bikes, drifted in silently, eyes glistening as they traced Jack's story from hero to legend. One regular 80-year-old Mr. Benson shuffled in every afternoon with a steaming mug of dark roast. He settled into a corner seat near the tapes and, gazing at Jack's image, murmured, "I once saw a German shepherd named Lucky pull a child from a tidal wave back in 1967. But Jack was something else entirely." His voice, heavy with nostalgia, carried through the air as though every word brushed against the wooden rafters. Others around him nodded in quiet agreement, some whispering, "That dog saved 2 lives we almost lost." The coffee shop had become more than a place for lattes. It was a living archive of collective memory, where each visitor found a shard of solace in Jack's unyielding courage. Nearby, Sheriff Daniel Stone often came alone. He would sit on a bench facing the river, his uniform jacket folded neatly beside him. He stared at the Potomac's gentle waves as though seeking an answer in its currents. "I still think I owe Jack an apology," he confided one afternoon to Esther, who joined him with her tattered notebook. "I relied on legal codes, but Jack taught me that sometimes the law sleeps while justice waits." Stone rested a hand on Esther's shoulder, recalling the dream where Jack's eyes shone brighter than any lighthouse, a silent summons to open his heart. He had even drafted a letter of regret to Jack's memory, though he knew no earthly address would suffice for an immortal guardian of truth. Esther, pen poised over her journal, offered her own reflection. "There are flames that burn beyond the page, beyond any byline. We chase deadlines, but Jack reminds us that justice doesn't arrive on schedule. It arrives when hearts awaken." She nodded to Grace and Ethan, now 10 years old, entering the shop hand in hand. Grace, lively and bright-eyed, carried a small leather diary. "When Jack took his last breath, I wrote, 'I have learned what love really is.'" She flipped it open to reveal a watercolor of Jack's final swim among golden waves. Ethan, more reserved, set down his BMX bike helmet and walked to a statue sketch pinned to the cafe wall. It showed Jack's muzzle gripping the cradle, the river raging behind him. He tapped the sketch gently and asked Margaret, "Do you think Jack hears me when I speak to him?" Margaret smiled through tears. "He always hears you, my dear," she replied, slipping her arm around Ethan's shoulder. Outside, Herminia, the elderly neighbor once critical of Margaret, approached Jack's statue at the plaza. She offered a single white lily, eyes red with regret. "I once doubted her," she murmured, gazing up at Jack's bronze eyes etched with unwavering resolve. "Now, I'm grateful he reminded me that compassion endures, even when we grow weary. Father Michael Reynolds stood in the fading light, leading a brief prayer service by the riverbank. His voice rose in an ancient hymn, calling for unnamed spirits to rest and for broken hearts to find hope. Grant solace to those without names, he intoned, and ignite in us the faith we thought was lost. As evening deepened, Margaret settled into her rocker on the porch, Charlie recording the moment on VHS one last time. Grace and Ethan nestled beside her, holding hands and watching the bronze dog stand sentinel against the twilight sky. "Jack," Margaret whispered, lifting the silver locket from her pocket, still engraved with EC. 17th of July, our love, forever, and placed it on her grandson's camera. Though he is gone, he never truly left us. Charlie lowered the camera, his eyes bright with hope. He never said goodbye, he said softly. But I know he's still with us, watching. Behind them, the Potomac swelled gently, its surface mottled with lavender and gold. As the camera panned upward to the darkening sky, the river's rhythmic murmur felt like a promise. If one day the winds changed and the water carried memory downstream, those who listened, those who dared to hear, would never forget the dog who refused to be silenced. As the golden sun dips below the Potomac, we remember Jack's unwavering spirit, proof that one act of kindness can echo through generations. If this tale moved you, let it remind you of Jane Goodall's wisdom. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. Your comments and subscriptions fuel Veilmarks' mission to create even more meaningful, high-quality videos. Subscribe now and help us reach 1,000 friends who believe in the power of storytelling. Together, we'll honor the legacy of silent heroes and celebrate the lessons they leave behind. Thank you for watching until the very end. Your support means everything.